Hello and welcome to the My Workplace Culture podcast. My name is John Bradbury and I'm the founder of Workplace Culture. We help managers develop their leaders with a collaborative mastermind program called Evolving Leaders. On this podcast, I speak to leaders about the cultures that shape them and the cultures they've gone on to shape. My guests are everyday, ordinary people doing extraordinary things at work. They aren't famous, they're just effective leaders. You don't have to be a famous guru to teach how to be an effective leader. These are the unsung heroes of workplaces. In many cases, the people I speak with have developed as leaders and are having a significant impact on many people around them in large workplaces. How can we understand and learn from these influencing skills? I offer some coaching opportunities after each podcast as ways to apply what has been discussed in a pragmatic way. My first guest is the Vice President of Operational Safety at Thales, Australia, Tony Broughton. Tony started his career in engineering before moving into general operations management at major companies, including the pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca, where Tony headed operations in both Australia and the UK. Tony is incredibly passionate about the well-being of his employees. We had such a fascinating discussion, I had to spread our chat across 2 episodes. This first episode explores the cultures that shaped Tony, specifically the cultures of blame and shame he experienced as a young worker that made him want to lead and develop better cultures later in his career. So, welcome, Tony. Great to see you.
Thanks very much, John. Great to see you again.
Before we start, what I thought I might do, because we're talking about workplace culture today, is just to read a definition of workplace culture, which comes from Ed Schein, who was an emeritus professor at MIT at Sloan School of Management, and he's quite well known in the area of culture in the workplace. He's written a number of books, and his definition is quite detailed. I thought it'd be worth sharing that with our listeners as a sort of place to start from. So Ed Schein's definition of culture is it's a pattern of shared basic assumptions invented, discovered, or developed by a given group as it learns to cope with its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore is to be taught to new members of the group as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. It's quite a detailed definition, but what it says to me is that culture is not a simple thing to impact, and it runs deep, and a lot of it is going on under the surface, and therefore, as leaders, it requires a lot from us if we want to actually have an impact on that. Does that make sense, that definition?
Yeah, it does. Well, he knows a lot more about it than I do, but I certainly agree that it's a complex beast. And it takes a lot of effort to shift a culture. That's probably one of my key learnings, certainly from the time with AstraZeneca. Yeah. It takes a lot of effort, really concerted effort.
Yes, and I think hopefully we can talk a bit about the AstraZeneca experience. And I think what would be the way I'd like to go with the podcast is to explore your career experience, if you like, and to share anything that you've learned along the way, as a way of offering listeners, food for thought, if you like, and possibly, ways to help people who are currently in a position of leadership, and dealing with the challenges of leading a culture. So, with that in mind, how far back shall we go?
When I was a boy.
So, I've got your bio here, and you studied engineering at UTS.
Yeah.
Sydney.
I actually started studying agricultural science, of all things, because I grew up on a farm, and that probably influenced my thinking about culture and leadership in some subtle ways, I guess. I spent a lot of time on my own, and my parents were very trusting. I had a great upbringing, and a fair bit of risk-taking involved on a farm, motorcycles and horses and lots of adventures. So I probably grew up with a relatively low need for control, and I was used to a high level of trust from my parents and the environment I grew up in. And I was thinking about, those influences. I think that certainly influenced my early and mid career. And so having grown up on a farm, I decided the natural thing to do was go and study agricultural science, which I actually didn't do so well at, didn't enjoy. So after a couple of years, I switched across into engineering.
I liked your reference to trust. I think that's a huge part of, creating a good culture in an organization is if you can develop trust with employees, what a massive thing that is to do. So you did engineering then, having not worked out with agricultural science. And then after completing your engineering, or actually, was it during your engineering degree that you did some work with Lion, or was that after
Yeah,
the
and
engineering
I
degree?
did some cadetships during my engineering studies, and then one of my first roles, not the first, but one of my first roles was with Lion, what
Yeah.
was known at the time as Tui's breweries in Sydney,
Oh, yeah.
looking after
Yeah.
maintenance, and that was quite a deep end experience. I've got to say, I was given a lot more responsibility than I probably should have been given at the time. I think another trust experience didn't always go well, and it was a pretty tough time for me. I actually think it was a bit too much too soon for me in my career. And whilst I'm certainly an advocate of taking a risk with people and letting them have some deep end experiences, that one was quite a challenge and quite a difficult experience actually. I was only in my, I think, mid to late 20s, and I had a very large team with a lot of pressure, in a high-paced environment where if a machine was to break down, which it did quite frequently in that factory, it was always urgent, and I was always on call. It's a pretty challenging time.
Look, I mean, I've got personal experience of working in those sort of environments, and I definitely I've seen many a maintenance manager under stress.
Yeah.
I mean, that role is definitely, under the pump most of the time in those high-paced environments. So I'm curious. I'm going to go with my curiosity here. Like when you were there under pressure, sort of feeling like you're in at the deep end, were you able to look for support from above? Was that readily available?
To some extent, but not always. And that was one of the challenges.
Mm.
It was the environment that we were working in. I was actually a contractor providing a maintenance service to the brewery. And so I didn't truly feel part of the team. I felt like a service provider. And to be frank, I got beat up on quite a lot for everything that was going wrong in this large, complex plant. And I got some good support from within my own organisation and from my leaders, but not always. And there was one particular moment I remember where I didn't feel that support, and it was quite disheartening. And it certainly didn't help me sort of push through the challenges when I didn't feel that I was trusted. I felt like I was being micromanaged. And I think as you go through your career, you learn from great experiences of leadership that you see around you, whether it's your own manager or somebody else. But you also learn from not so great experiences. And I think you've got to learn to appreciate both of those. I've learned some great things from some really fantastic, supportive, inspiring leaders and managers of my own. But on the other hand, I've learned some important lessons as well about perhaps those things I would note down as what not to do. And they're just as valuable as experiences, I think. It doesn't feel great at the time, but looking back, they were valuable experiences, and there were certainly some of those experiences during that time at Lion.
Yeah, I imagine, like, having had that experience, you're in a better position to see other people in the organization now who may be struggling and offer a helping hand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got to give young leaders some rope and let them make some mistakes on their own, but you've also got to make sure that the support's there so that they don't sink. It's pretty important.
Yeah, great. That's a good one. And as a matter of interest, you were in that role under pressure. Was it the Was it the challenge of fixing equipment that was creating the pressure, or was it more about the relationships with people around you and that created the pressure, or both?
Look, the equipment doesn't yell at you. The equipment doesn't really give you a hard time on Monday morning after a weekend with
Yeah,
lots of breakdowns. It was the people that give you a hard time, and
yeah,
uh, yeah, there were some good times at that plant, but I do actually remember, yeah, some pretty, without being too dramatic, some dark days, particularly Mondays after a weekend of lots of breakdowns, and yeah, I remember not feeling um, a sense of collaboration, or not feeling a sense that we were in this together. Yeah, there was quite a bit of blame and finger pointing and accusation, and that really took the wind out of my sails. I was still quite a young engineer at the time, and finding my feet, and working out not only how to deal with the technical side of the problem, but how to work through these complex relationships, which felt quite one-sided. It was me with I don't know, half a dozen brewery managers on the other side of the table, and it felt yeah, it felt like quite a battle at times.
and that must have been quite a rude awakening, so to speak, after growing up in an environment where you felt a lot of
Yeah,
trust. So to go from that trust to a lack of
yeah,
trust must have been, yeah, I can imagine that would have been very
yeah,
challenging. So it sounds like you gritted your teeth and just went through on
yeah. For
determination.
as long as I could, John. It didn't last a long time. It was a
Yeah,
couple of years, and I did learn a lot. But a new opportunity came along, and let's put it this way: it didn't take much convincing for me to take that new opportunity and see what was in
yes,
store.
and that was, if I'm correct, operations manager at Shearing Plough. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I got this
Yeah.
call, shearing plough, and I'd never heard of the company. My first instinct, I thought it had something to do with agriculture, shearing and ploughs. I worked out pretty quickly it was a pharmaceutical company, what's now known as Merck, and I
Yeah,
really relished in that opportunity. I felt like I found my home and my place in the world
great.
from an industry and work perspective. So really enjoyed that time.
So that was a call that just came out of the blue, was it? That are you interested in an
Yeah,
operations manager's
yeah,
role? Yeah, somebody must have given them your
yeah,
name.
yeah. And I was interviewed by a chap who, I owe a great deal of thanks to. Talk about career learnings. John Owen was his name, and I remember during the interview process, the final interview stage, he sort of folded his arms and took a deep breath, and he said, "Look, Tony, I've got a number of candidates who've got a lot more experience and a lot more credential than you. Would be better suited to the role, but I'm actually going to take a bit of a chance with you and give you this opportunity." I was still fairly young, and I'm really thankful John did, and I learned a lot from that myself about taking a chance with people and looking for potential, and getting behind people who you think have got potential, taking a chance. Yeah.
What do you think it was that he saw in you?
Well, I don't really know, but I guess why I relished that opportunity once I secured that role was it seemed to bring together sort of my technical DNA as an engineer with this interest that I was still discovering, and this passion, I guess you'd call it now, for people and for leading people. And it was an intersection of those two things at that company where, and again with a lot of trust. John was a very trusting manager, really let me fly, and I was quite quickly given a lot of responsibility for some multi-million-dollar projects, and quite frankly, I didn't know what I was doing. I had no experience in the pharmaceutical industry. I just had to learn. I had to gather information from other experienced people, and so again, that trust equation played out. really strongly there. I felt trusted. I felt empowered. I felt supported. And I flourished in that environment. I got a lot of confidence from that.
Yeah, it sounds like it was very different from the
Yeah,
previous
it was quite a
role.
contrast. Yeah.
And how big was the team there at Shearing Plough that you
Initially,
inherited?
it was fairly small. I think maybe 8 or 10 people, and then within 18 months, that was more like 40 or 50 running the factory. So it was a small factory, and unfortunately, it's no longer there. And it's gone the way of much of the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector has gone in Australia. But that's probably where I really got grounding and found my feet in leading people, and understanding the challenges, and learning some of the techniques that have served me since.
The fact that you were trusted then would, I guess, affect your leadership style. So someone who feels trusted in a role is going to lead very differently from someone who feels no trust.
Yeah, there's this school of thought that says trust has to be earned, which suggests that you're starting from a point of zero trust, which is a very difficult place from which to build trust. I think my sense working with John at Shearing Plough was I started at 100% trust. The trust wasn't earned, it was granted. And then I had to maintain it. And so a different way of thinking about the starting point. John made a decision that I was trustworthy and made a judgment that he would trust me. And then I had to maintain that trust through performance. I think that's a better way of thinking about the trust equation. But it is absolutely central, I think, to how a person feels about their work, and whether they feel confident. Because I think trust builds confidence. I think trust builds enthusiasm. And that leads to higher effort, higher discretionary effort, as opposed to an environment where there's a lot of micromanagement and where the trust is lacking. And that was certainly my experience at Shearing Plough.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And it's a good point you make about starting with trust, because doesn't it sound weird? We're going to employ you, but we're going to start with zero trust.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
I think that happens.
That way.
Yeah, I think the benefits of starting by trusting people far outweigh the other way. You start from this position of trust, and then it just grows. That's highly likely to grow as things develop. So, and it sounds like that's what happened with you at Shearing Plough. Were there any key moments there that you recall at all that were part of your experience?
Yeah, look, I remember one day you talk about learning from mistakes, and trust plays into this again. But there was one day where the team had forgotten to install a filter on a fluid bed dryer, and so they went about filling this fluid bed dryer with a drug substance. It was actually an antihistamine product designed for people who suffer hay fever and the like. And so filled up this machine and switched it on. And because the filter was missing, we blew 2 tons of drug product straight out the side of the building and onto a golf driving range next door. So I think all of the golfers for the next month or two would have had very clear nasal passages, but yeah, that was a couple of $1 million mistake. And not only did the operator feel terrible about that, but I, as a production manager, it had never happened to me before. And so you immediately start worrying about what the reaction's going to be, what the response is going to be. And I distinctly remember my manager saying, well, that's a $2 million training exercise. I'm pretty sure we won't do that again. And that was it. Of course, we had to go and understand what happened and make sure that we had arrangements in place to prevent that from happening again. But I was really impressed, I guess, by the grace and the understanding and the willingness to learn rather than to just blame and criticize, which really wouldn't have helped us get better as an organization in that moment. So I've learned a lot from that and many other stories like that over the years, how important it is to, yes, hold people accountable, but the path of blame is, I think, a road to nowhere. And yeah, seeking to learn, and considering all of the factors around and about when something goes wrong, rather than just who made a mistake. Because we're humans, we're fallible, we will make mistakes. It's completely normal. It shouldn't be a surprise. So even in the last few years, I've been trying to learn more about how to avoid a blame culture, how to create a learning culture,
Yes.
one where
Yeah.
you learn when things are going well, but also learn when things are not going so well.
Look, I'm just making some notes here because I think that's such a big point. Things are always going to go wrong, and the sort of conversations we have around that um, are so important because everyone's watching as well. It's like when something goes wrong, everyone's, oh, how's this? What's going to happen now? Sort of thing. And so, in those moments, I think they're key moments for reinforcing whatever the culture is that you have.
Yeah.
If we go back to Shine's definition, it's like what sort of assumption do we want to create amongst our people about the way problems are handled? And I think clearly we want to create an assumption that it's going to be handled respectfully and we're going to learn from the mistake. But if it's a blame thing, then that's just a totally different dynamic in an organization. I've experienced both. And, it's refreshing to work in a culture where you don't get hammered for a mistake, but you are expected to learn from it. I mean, that's a natural course of action. But then you're more willing to take risks, I think, to get great results if you know that you're not going to get hammered for a mistake.
Absolutely, John. Yeah,
Yeah.
it leads to that greater desire to take calculated risks. If people know that the environment is such that they're not going to get hammered for making a mistake, it also, and arguably more importantly, leads to a culture of transparency where nothing is left under the table, everything is on the table. And problems are seen as opportunities to improve and grow. Yes, there has to be accountability and resolution, but as soon as you've got a culture where blame is a feature, then things will go under the table and things will be left unsaid, and mistakes will, worst case, be covered up and tracks covered, and that can lead to all sorts of problems culturally, from a safety point of view, for example. From a relationship point of view, if things aren't cleaned up after a relationship problem, these can also be left to fester. So, an environment where people feel comfortable and confident to speak up and speak out about things,
Yes.
it's really important. It's absolutely foundational.
Yeah. Look, I think if people are willing to say, "I made that mistake," that was me. You've got a good culture then if people are saying that sort of thing, because there's an openness about that. And like you described, the knock-on effects in either example are big. It's like you can either have a really positive knock-on effect by having that openness and honesty, or you can have quite a negative knock-on effect and ripple through the team by hiding things.
And leaders,
So,
perhaps more so, the more willing they are to share their mistakes and be transparent and vulnerable and honest and authentic. I think that builds a greater sense of transparency right through an organisation.
yeah, for sure.
It's more important for leaders to do that than anything else, and lead by example.
Yeah, yeah. And then that sort of that speaks to I think a commitment to self-development. And when a leader's building their own self-awareness and the messages that they're sending, then if they're willing to keep looking at themselves and commit to their own development, then the chances are they're going to create an improving culture as they go along. because not everyone comes into this, into leadership with a natural authenticity and those skills that you've just described. So I think there are things that you can develop, but you need to, we come back to that trust thing again. You need to be in a position where you feel like you're trusted in order to show that vulnerability and develop those, those skills of authenticity and openness and honesty. So that's, we're touching on how hard it is to change a culture, because if you've got leaders who don't demonstrate those qualities, getting them to demonstrate those qualities, that development path, first of all, they have to be even willing to look at that, and then engage in in a process of self-development, which not everyone is prepared to do.
That absolutely goes to the heart, John, of the challenge of culture change. The leaders have to want to change themselves. And many leaders that I know, and probably most, but not all, have worked on themselves. It hasn't just happened by accident. They've made their way into the leadership role that they're in. The folly or the mistake that's perhaps too easy to make is when leaders take a position that everybody else needs to change, without first looking here inside themselves. And my first experience was of that was one that wasn't voluntary. Actually, I was offered an opportunity to go on a leadership development program, and that was great. I grabbed that with both hands and really enjoyed it. But it's not something I would have necessarily automatically done myself. So it took my leader to take the initiative to send me on this program, and the program involved feedback and 360, and it was brutal. I learned a lot about myself and that I didn't know, and so that there began a journey of, I guess, discovering my blind spots and my strengths and starting to work on those. But it took an act from my manager to actually initiate that. And so important lesson there, I guess, is people won't automatically be in that mode of self-discovery, of self-improvement, and sharpening their leadership skills. Sometimes it's a leader's role to be the catalyst for someone else to get into that mode. But one thing's for sure, if leaders at the top of an organisation aren't committed to and willing to continue to shape their leadership right through their career, it shouldn't stop when you reach 40 or 50. I think it's got to be ongoing. If they're not willing to do that, to continue to work on themselves, then they can't reasonably expect everybody else in the organisation to change. I think there's got to be a quid pro quo.
Yeah, it does. I've not seen that work where a senior person takes that "I'm okay" position, but you're not. You've got some development to do, but I'm all right. It just doesn't seem to work. Whereas the role modeling of self-development is a very powerful tool, and it's a non-verbal thing. And it's like, if I look at my leader and see them working on themselves, it's just such a powerful message. Yeah. And it gives me permission to do that with myself. And like you, I was actually one of the people who had the most powerful effect on me was someone like that, who invested in me, showed constant interest in my development. And that was a guy called Paul Bennett, who was a leader at Arnott's, and he was constantly interested in my development. And you never forget that sort of interest. You never forget that influence, and it's very powerful.
Leaves a mark.
And
it does.
It leaves a mark, and I think it's good that we're touching on this in this discussion, because anyone who's listening will either agree or maybe learn a little bit about this, about the importance of doing this, or they've already had some experience where they'll agree with what we're saying. Very good. Um, so shall we move on from shearing plough? You moved then in 2005, Tony, to what's become a household name now, AstraZeneca, um, for recent events. You moved to AstraZeneca's operations manager in Sydney, and you were there for 3 years. So tell us a little bit about that experience. How was that different from shearing plough? Was it different from
Yeah,
shearing plough?
when I joined the pharmaceutical industry with shearing plough and started networking and getting to know people in the industry, AstraZeneca was held up as one of the pinnacle organisations. And when I arrived at AstraZeneca, I found that to be true or deserved. They really did things, and I believe continue to do things very well. Very high level of professionalism and perfectionism, which you'd like to expect from a pharmaceutical company making things that get injected, inhaled, and ingested. So no, I was really impressed with the high standards in every aspect of the work, the facility, and the investment in culture, the investment in leadership, the investment in people. I saw it right across the organisation. Really high standards.
They had an awareness of culture and they wanted to get that right, and they were prepared to put their money where their mouth was.
Yeah,
basically.
I think during the time I was there, the awareness grew, and there was a change in the global CEO to Pascal Soriot, who is still the CEO today, and he certainly brought an increased focus on culture at a global level. And I saw something of a transformation happen over the following years through that focus and through that investment. We spoke earlier about culture being a difficult thing to change and requires a lot of effort and investment. And I certainly saw that during the time at AstraZeneca, that level of commitment at the most senior level of the company. It was the first thing Pascal spoke about, and when you watch his videos online, it's still today the first thing he speaks about in most contexts. He really values getting the cultural settings right so that people can thrive in the workplace and do their best work. It was a real privilege, quite frankly, to be part of that journey from the early days when there were a number of events and activities and discussions and quite a bit of soul searching as well, employee surveys and which can sometimes be quite brutal when you read the feedback for the first time. But the organisation really embraced that and got on that journey in a serious way. And I think within just a few years, those engagement scores started to lift and you started to feel a change. So it was a great example of what is possible, even in a large organisation. I think we were 65,000 people strong at the time. And you did start to see a shift within 2 or 3 years, a noticeable shift, a positive shift.
Did that journey then involve like conversations about these things with employees? Because it's like often in these FMCG environments, the priority is getting the product out at a high quality, low cost, and that's where the main focus is. When it comes to culture, that's a completely different conversation, isn't it? It's like it's like how we work together rather than what we're doing.
Yeah, it's one level removed from what's in front of you today. The objectives and the targets and the priorities of the moment. And it took a while to get used to that type of conversation for me, and I think for many others. It felt historically like culture was the domain of HR, and that they would look after that. And people would describe it as warm and fuzzy, the soft aspects of work. And I guess it took a while for us to adapt and get used to those conversations and for them to actually create some value and some meaning. But yes, to answer your first question, there were extensive conversations more than one, many conversations that unfolded over years, and I got to experience that here in Australia. Workshops, local workshops, global workshops, team-based workshops, and then later in my time with AstraZeneca in the UK, again continued workshops and discussions to really try to get to the heart of what would make a difference. But it all started from this belief that a strong, positive culture will lead to better performance. And perhaps it's a leap of faith still for some people today, but I think AstraZeneca has proved out that theory over the last 10 or so years, a bit more than that now. And because it goes to things like staff retention, staff performance, discretionary effort. These things can be a bit difficult to measure, but the investment is the thing that probably, when I reflect back, John, the investment of time and resources to have those, to allow those conversations and to respond to them, and to follow up, and not to just leave them hanging as some nice conversations that we had, to actually do something about it, particularly when it came to shaping leadership and leadership practices and behaviours and norms in the company, and setting high standards around that. There's some really practical things that came out of those discussions.
From what you're saying, the company was fortunate to have someone at the top who had that as part of their focus and has remained there consistently, doing that consistently.
Absolutely.
Because it's definitely not a quick fix. And if often those roles at the top of an organization are a revolving turnstile. And so, you're constantly introducing a new influence on the culture. So that makes it more difficult to be consistent, I think. But I'm curious about, in those years then with AstraZeneca, what did it draw from you in terms of your, having those conversations, which is a different sort of conversation? What did it demand of you as a person, as a leader, that was different?
Yeah, I think it was in that phase of my journey. Some call it the career transition phase, where you're deciding and working out, where your career is going to go, whether you're going to remain a technical specialist, a manager, or whether you're going to become a generalist and focus more on general broad leadership. And throughout that period, I think the constant through that for all of the leaders at the company was reflecting on one's own leadership capability constantly, not once a year, but through a series of interactions and leadership discussions, forums. And the company wasn't trying to be too formulaic about it and create this kind of completely uniform set of practices where everybody had to comply. It wasn't that sort of approach, but it was expected that leaders would reflect, would seek feedback, and would act on that feedback, and that was became deeply part of the way of working of the company. And so, again, for me, and that's the moment I referred to earlier, where I had that first experience of seeking feedback in a very formal way and reflecting on that. And I did that more than once during my 8 years with AZ. And I probably learned more through that experience about myself, about my blind spots, about things I needed to work on than anything else. And I really appreciate that experience.
And how did in a hierarchy of an organization, it's like making it safe to give feedback about your boss or your boss's boss, was that made possible in AstraZeneca? Were people willing to own their feedback, or was it done anonymously? How was that handled?
I think in the early years it was anonymous. It was a classical 360 survey where there's people give you ranking on different questions, and then there's some free text. And yeah, the temptation was to spend a bit of time trying to work out who said what. But I think the environment was such that within 2 or 3 years, probably shifted to more transparent, um, direct, face-to-face feedback, where that became the norm. The thing I learned there was to, feedback can be difficult to give for the giver, especially to their manager. And so you've got to create that safe environment, and you've got to give them a bit of warning and a bit of setup. Simply asking somebody for feedback without notice, I don't know, at the end of the meeting can be a bit of a throwaway. If you're really intent on getting serious feedback, I think giving people some time to prepare, collect their thoughts, and make their point well. Yeah, it's you owe it to your people to set that up. And I think giving people the opportunity to provide feedback anonymously is good. That can be helpful. I think it's good to try to graduate from that, as well as trust within a team builds, and to be able to get to a point where feedback is continuous, and it's in the moment, and it's specific, and it's anchored in a specific moment, not generic. I think you've got to aim to get to that place, but you've got to start perhaps at a more basic level.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's quite a skill, I think, to be present enough first to give feedback in the moment, and then to find the right words. And if we're trying to, when we're trying to make it safe for people to give feedback up the organization from, in the hierarchy, that's a very challenging thing to do. And I think that takes time. It's like one of the key things is not to react emotionally to anything negative that's coming at you, because people then tend to listen to the emotion rather than what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, what people will watch very carefully. If I'm giving my boss feedback, I'm going to be careful and watch to see whether she or he has an emotional response.
Yeah.
And then that will tell me whether it's safe or not. So if it's met with a negative emotional response, I'm much less likely to repeat that experiment.
I think the most important response when you're receiving feedback is thank you, and to really acknowledge and thank the person, and then to show a commitment to do something with it. And something I learned from a manager who, having received some feedback, and I think most of that had been delivered anonymously, he played back the feedback in summary to the team, explained the actions that he was going to take, and then asked the team to hold him accountable for those actions over the coming weeks and months. I thought that was great. That showed it showed that he'd listened, it showed that he was committed to action, and it further reinforced the transparent, sort of open culture that he was trying to create. So I thought it was a really good practice.
Oh, look, I think that's like a level of maturity that is required really to create the right culture. But it is something that I think that's a skill that can be learned. It's like, but it takes time. It's like a willingness to understand. Sometimes, I might have an emotional reaction to someone's feedback, but I don't want that to overwhelm me and dominate the proceedings. And maybe the answer is, it's like I've got to learn to listen better and get curious about the feedback. I think it's better to go with curiosity than defense.
Absolutely.
If I come back with defense, tell me more. That's right. Can you expand on that? And then try and get a really thorough understanding and let that, and then it's like recognizing the emotional reaction if there is one, and just putting it to one side is a skill that can be learned but takes time. I speak from experience. Yeah. Okay, very good. So, with AstraZeneca, then you began your career in Sydney, but then you had this amazing experience of well, you became the director of supply and manufacturing for a couple of years in 2008
That was
in
here in
Sydney.
Sydney. Yeah.
Yeah. So in other words, you took on greater responsibility by the looks of things. Probably did that involve more people?
Yeah, I think that was a team of about 500 at the time. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's pretty significant. So going from operations manager to a team of 500, then as director of supply and manufacturing, how was that switch? How was that change for you? Was that a significant move at the time, from what you remember?
I don't doesn't feel like a particularly enormous change when I think back on it.
Hmm.
But it was during a really interesting time for the company, and I can talk about this because it's in the public domain. But there were a lot of challenges to rationalise the footprint of AstraZeneca around the world, and to make a long story short, it led to a decision that the Australian operations would need to close. And so that was a very difficult time to navigate and to lead the team through. And not something you ever want to do, to have to announce closure of an organisation or a site or a factory. Really difficult. But still, like we were talking about earlier, you learn lessons through the good and the bad times, through the on the mountains, but also on the valleys. And I think I learned there again the importance of transparency. And whilst it was difficult to tell people everything that was going on, I think that commitment to telling people as soon as possible once we knew what was happening. I think people appreciated that, even though it was a really difficult announcement for people. In the end, that closure didn't go ahead, and the factory is thriving and has had huge investments in Australia
Yes.
since. But
Yeah.
you learn from these experiences for sure.
Well, that must have been a bit of a roller coaster for everybody.
It was, yeah. We had people who were obviously devastated. The operations had been there at North Ryde for decades, so it was quite a shock. And then you had a small number of people who were actually quite happy and were looking forward to the next chapter and getting a bit of financial support to do something else. So and then when the decision was later changed, you had a whole lot of different mixed emotions as well. So tricky times to navigate, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'd imagine that must have been quite challenging, to say the least. So taking people through that roller coaster of you haven't got a job. Oh, now you have got a job. How did you? What approach did you take to that? Was that a lot of conversations going on at the time, and
yeah, I think
communications with
the overall, what helped us was and we brought in some external advice to help us get this right. But there was a lot of planning. So that was the first thing. The conversations that we needed to have and the communications that needed to be delivered were very highly planned. We didn't make things up on the fly. We were quite particular. And embedded throughout all those communications, I think we tried to respect the individual and the impact on the individual, and really understand, it's personal. This one of these sayings you hear in business. It's not personal, it's business. Well, it is personal. For the person on the receiving end, it's very personal.
Oh yeah.
And
yes.
So just being aware of that impact and anticipating it, planning for it, being respectful of people's emotions, and taking time to walk people through this change. I'll never forget announcing the closure. And I thought I'd been quite clear, but then a hand went up in the room during the question time, and And the gentleman asked, so does that mean the factory is closing? And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that he hadn't understood what I'd said. But it was a real lesson for me that sometimes you've got to say things multiple times in multiple different ways for people to understand. And you've got to respect that everybody processes information a bit differently. But I think the main thing, John, was just respecting the individual, acknowledging the impact on people, moving beyond, the reasons and the rationale and the business case to just acknowledging that this is hard. This is going to impact on our people, and we regret that, and we don't back away from the decision, but we also respect the impact on people. I think that was really important, and the team that were part of planning all of those interactions, communications and meetings, I think they did a great job, and we received good feedback from staff that even though it was a regrettable decision, they felt that
yes,
not only the decision, but then the conversations and the actions that followed showed a lot of respect for people. Even as people were starting to leave the business, which a few did, before the decision was reversed. That sense of being respected, even in the midst of a tough decision.
As you're speaking, what I'm struck by is something like that affects those individuals, but then it ripples through their families.
Yeah, and I can tell you in that situation, it was a rocky landscape. It was rocky. It was a lot for people to take in, as you'd expect.
Yeah.
Some people have been with the company 30, 35 plus years, the whole professional career. So,
yes.
Yeah.
And then, they've got mortgages and things like that. And, it's like suddenly their world isn't as stable as it was the day before. So, it's quite a responsibility, isn't it? I guess you felt that at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Deeply. And, but I think that's important. That's good to feel that pressure and that weight as a leader to handle those situations well, and not to do so with any sense of distance, I guess. And it was going to affect different people in different ways. Some people were going to stay with the company, and I was going to be staying with the company. So just recognising that as well, that the impacts were going to be felt unevenly. Yeah,
well, anyway, thankfully that was reversed, and as you say, that site has gone from strength to strength since then, which is great news. That was the first episode with Tony Broughton. Here are some coaching moments from today's show. Use negative experiences of leadership to learn and identify how you want to lead and treat the people you lead. What is it you don't want to role model? Can you identify 3 times you observed leadership behavior that showed you what not to do? How are you managing mistakes? Are you looking for someone to blame, or are you helping people to learn from their mistakes without humiliating them? How did you manage the last mistake a team member made? As a leader, have you made a commitment to develop yourself? What actions have you taken in the last 12 months to develop your skills as a leader of people? If you're curious to hear more about Tony's experiences, look for episode 2 in your podcast app. In the second episode, we hear about Tony's experience leading AstraZeneca's operations in the UK, and we dig deeper into the challenge of leading workplace culture.